Hi, friends. You know, facing danger is just part and parcel of life. Now, living here in the UK, we're fortunate in that we don't have to face any dangers of the sort of the natural variety. There's hardly ever any sort of earthquakes or serious floods here. But there are dangers that are outside of nature's, dangers in the world, dangers from real people. Sometimes those dangers can be nothing more than like a car accident, or maybe they can be caused by someone intending to harm you in some way. But today we're going to be looking at a scripture which I believe gives us some insights of how we should react when we face danger. And today we're launching off in Genesis chapter 32. Now, the Bible's Project podcast is a project to work through the whole Bible together, chapter by chapter, verse by verse, over the next number of years. A quick reminder, if you're joining for the first time, there's always a transcript of every one of these talks available in the episode notes of any audio version of the website, or any audio version of the podcast. It doesn't matter where you're receiving it on, what platform it in. If you link through, you'll see episode notes, and contained there will be a transcript of what I've said. And these transcripts and the talks themselves, I put them in the public domain. They're free for you to use in any way you want. Now, a credit for the podcast is always appreciated, but it's not necessary. I'm happy for you to take these resources and use them. Create your own materials from them, your own Bible teaching, Bible study, even preaching resources. Do with them as you wish, with my blessing. Anyway, that's it for now. I'll see you at the end of the main study, where I'll give you some links and some ideas about ways in which you can connect with the ministry and also receive more teaching and resources. But right now we'll just jump into the main text and look at today's study. Hi there, welcome back. We're beginning a new chapter of Genesis today. We're looking at Genesis chapter 32, and we're coming back to this point of this story where Esau and Jacob are going to meet together. And because of what's going to happen here, I've called today's message Facing Danger. We're going to be a couple of days in chapter 32 because it's a fairly long chapter, but we'll work through it together and we'll see what it can teach us. Now, the reason I've called it what it is about preparing to face danger, is that it's useful for us to know and maybe get some biblical insights into facing danger, because danger is part and parcel of everyday life. Now, in the UK, particularly, I believe actually Ireland, where I grew up, is the most earthquake-free zone in the whole world. So growing up, I didn't have to face any sort of natural disaster, so to speak. But of course, not all dangers come from natural events. There are dangers outside of nature's which come in relationship to other people and what they do. Sometimes irresponsible attitudes by other people can lead to danger. I think of car accidents and things like that. But I grew up in the 1970s in Northern Ireland, where as a child the danger of a terrorist incident was ever present, and I actually had some rather close shaves with bombings that occurred very close to where I lived. Another very real danger that I faced was as a teenager. I used to have to transverse across Belfast to get to the school that I went to, and there was always a danger in the background of being attacked and beaten up by a sectarian gang. It was a very real possibility, particularly if I took a wrong turn or I ended up in the wrong part of the city from where I should have been. So my question today is simply, what should you do when you're faced with a danger that perhaps might even take your life? Now, what I'll have to say and what I'll have to extrapolate out of today's message and text is probably pretty straightforward to answer. And I think most of you will think, well, in a sense, that's just common sense that you should react in that way, particularly if you're a Christian believer. However, I would point out that some scriptures are written not to teach us anything new or give us any new information, but they're simply there to remind us what we should already know, or help us that it's important that we don't forget certain principles. And I think that's maybe the case here. So in going through this book of Genesis, as we've been doing over the past months, we've come upon the story of this man, Jacob, and we are reaching a point in his life when he's facing an imminent danger, a crisis. And the question is, okay, this is what is happening to him. How's he going to handle it? Of course, the man I'm talking about is Jacob, but I think it's useful in case you've just arrived at this with the idea of maybe doing a study of chapter 32 in isolation, and say that I'll just bring us up to speed with the story so far, if you like, because this Jacob character, well, he's a sort of interesting fellow, bit of a maverick character, some would say, because 20 years prior to this point, Jacob had in fact deceived his father and his brother's called Esau, by tricking Esau out of his birthright. Jacob tricked his father into him giving him Esau's inheritance instead of it going to his older brother. Now, as you can imagine, that didn't sit very well with his older brother, and in fact he threatened to kill him. So Jacob, at that point, left town. He fled what was then called Palestine and went down to a place called Haran, which today is in fact in modern Iraq. And he spends 20 years there. And in the process, in that time there, he gains 4 wives and he becomes a very wealthy man. But then the Lord appears to him and says, look, my will for your life, Jacob, is that you be back in Palestine. So in essence, he says to him, you need to go home. And as we open this chapter, Jacob is returning home, and he's facing the imminent personal danger, because he knows that there's a real chance that when he gets home, his brother will be hostile towards him, and it's quite likely his brother might still want to take his life. So the question is, how will he handle this situation? Now, I think it's a rather interesting story because it contains some significant spiritual principles on how we should approach things when we're facing a potentially dangerous situation. So let's just pick up the text in verse 1, where it says, So Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. When Jacob saw them, he said, This is God's camp, and he called the name of that place Mahanaim. Now keep in mind that he was in Haran, which is in modern-day Iraq, and he's now moving back towards what we would call into modern-day Israel, the Holy Land. Now, many commentators who look at this verse conclude that it indicates that he's now crossed the border, or is crossing the border, so to speak. So he's arriving back in the land of Israel, and the first thing that happens is he's met by an angel of the Lord. Now, we're not told anything about the particular meeting or what was said, but it's interesting that he's left the land and he's immediately met with the Lord as he returns to the area of Bethel. He's back in the land and he meets the Lord again. Now, most commentators, and I would agree with them, believe that this meeting was in order to give Jacob some reassurance. God had made it very clear that he will be with Jacob, and that he also, the promise was made that he would have lots of descendants, which seems to indicate he's not really likely to get killed then, if that's God's promise, isn't it? Perhaps the meeting with this angel of the Lord was to reassure him of that fact. At any rate, we're told Jacob said, I met with the Lord in this place, and both he and I set up camps here, and that's why he gives the place a name which actually means 2 camps. I think these opening verses are telling us that the Lord is attempting to reassure him by meeting with him there, and I can only think that that is the reason for that, was to sort of remind him of his promises and to reassure him. So let's just pause and say that the Lord God, remember, promised him, and the promise was that he was going to protect him. I can't help but make that point because the Lord tells us the very same thing, and the Bible tells us the very same thing. In Hebrews chapter 13, it says, "For us to be content with what we have, because God has said he will never leave us nor forsake us." Isn't that a wonderful promise to know and hear, that that same promise applies to us? If you're a believer in Jesus Christ and you know him as your Saviour, he has promised he will never leave you under any circumstances. But that's also the kind of thing that is going on here. In fact, it's the earliest example of that type of thing. So let's pick up the text in verse 3, which tells us, "Then Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau his brother in the land of Seir, the country of Edom. And he commanded them, saying, Speak thus to my lord Esau. Thus your servant Jacob says, I have dwelt with Laban and stayed there until now. I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, and the male and female servants. And I have sent to tell my lord that I might find favor in your sight." So at this point, we are told in verse 3 that Jacob decides to send messengers ahead of him. Now he's either about to cross the border or has just crossed the border, so he's approaching his homeland, and he sends messengers ahead in the knowledge that they'll run into his older brother. And notice he says to the messengers, he turns to them and says, "Tell my lord Esau." Now this is a very strategic statement, because earlier we were told in the promise that the older was going to serve the younger, and those, of course, were a confrontation, fighting words, if you like, to Esau when it happened those 20 years ago. So here we now, as he's returning to the land 20 years later, Jacob is flipping this and saying, "I accept in this situation that you are my Lord and Master." As a matter of fact, he refers to himself as a servant. So he's really trying to be as diplomatic as possible with his older brother, isn't he? But then why does he bring up all this stuff about the oxen and the donkeys and the flocks and the fact that he has male and female servants? Why is he telling that? Why is he signaling that to Esau? Well, I believe he is, in fact, yes, he's doing that. He's sending a signal to say that, look, I'm not coming here for a handout. I'm self-sufficient, he's telling him. I've gained a lot of wealth during my 20 years that I've been gone, and I've come back, yes, but I've not come back to be a burden or a threat to you or your family. So he's actually sort of, in a sense, signaling, asking permission, look, here I am, can we come back and sort things out? And that's why I believe he sends the messengers ahead of him. And the messengers come back, and this is what happens when they come back, and this is what they tell him in verse 6. "Then the messengers returning to Jacob, saying, we came to your brother Esau, and he is coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him." Ooh, so the messengers come back and say, "Yeah, we met him, we told him what you said, and he's coming out to see you, but by the way, he's bringing 400 men with him." And one translation, a couple of the early translations, say 400 armed men with him. Oh, so the messengers say he's coming. Well, that's good, I suppose, but he's bringing 400 men with him. Not so good. This is Jacob's worst fear, isn't it? A very real danger, and something that Jacob feared might just happen. And as a matter of fact, the next verse confirms for us how Jacob felt about this, when it says, "So Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, and divided the people that were with him, and the flocks, and the herds, and the camels, into 2 companies. And he said, if Esau comes to the one company and attacks it, then the other company which is left will escape." That's interesting, isn't it? Now, wait a minute. Prior to this chapter, remember, just before these verses, the Lord had appeared to Jacob and reminded him that I'm going to be with you and I'm going to protect you. And at the beginning of this very chapter, an angel of the Lord had appeared to him again to reassure him of this fact. So one thing he should have known in this situation was the overall truth was the Lord was going to protect him. So in a sense, he must have forgotten that already, because the text is saying in verse 7, he wasn't saying that he wasn't just afraid, but that he was greatly afraid and distressed. We might even reasonably say he was close to panic. What am I going to do here? And why is he bringing 400 men with him? This can't be good. That's what he must have been thinking. But the Lord had said, trust me, Jacob, and Jacob just at the moment appears to have forgotten that. So does he panic? Well, now the story gets interesting. What does Jacob do? What should we do when we're facing danger? Well, the verses that follow suggest to me that he didn't panic. It seems that Jacob methodically made an approach and reacted and did some stuff. Let's just consider what he did. Number one, he came up with a plan. He came up with a plan to protect himself and his family. Look again at that opening verse 7 of this section detailing his response. He divides the people that were with him, along with their flocks and herds and animals, into two groups. Probably quite rightly thinking that if Esau attacks one group, then the other group can escape. That's not a stupid thing to do, I don't think. I mean, if you're facing danger, maybe the first thing we should do is have a plan, have an idea about how we should respond, right? If we're facing danger, maybe we too should come up with a strategic response. Then the second thing he does, very importantly, is he prays. So now let's look at that prayer and the content of it and what he says, picking up in verse 9. Then the Lord said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, the Lord has said to me, return to your country and to your family, and I will deal with you. I am not worthy of the least of all the mercies and of all the truth which you have shown your servant. For I have crossed over this Jordan with my staff, and now I have become two companies. Deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, lest he come and attack me, and the mother of my children as well. For he said, I will surely treat you well, and make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for the multitude. So he's praying at this point. That's good, but that's what we should all do, of course. But notice what he does in the prayer, he simply reminds the Lord of what he had said. He says, Lord, you promised me that if I went back home that you'd protect me. So it's very important sometimes to remind God of his promises. Not that it changes God and what he promised, but in doing so, it reminds us also. And Jacob is saying in his prayer, I'm just reminding you, Lord, and by nature himself, that of what you said. I'm scared at the moment. He seems to be openly admitting that, but I'm reminding you that what you said, and the truth was, you promised me that if I came back home, that you'd protect me. Then the third thing he does is he praises God. He counts his blessings. He said, you reveal truth to me. You've been merciful to me. You've blessed me. You've taken care of me. He's not coming to the Lord and reminding him of these promises and saying, you owe me this, Lord, because you promised. It's not that type of attitude at all. Rather, he's just saying, you promised me, Lord, but at the same time, I petition you, Lord, and humbly admit that I am not and I was never worthy of that promise. So he acknowledges what the Lord promises, but at the same time says, you know what, I'm not worthy. And after that, he then begins to get his petitions in, his requests in. Deliver me, please, Lord, he says. Deliver me, I pray, from the hands of my brother Esau, for I am afraid he might attack me and my wives and my children. I am fearful that he might come and destroy us all, even the women and children. So he's openly saying, Lord, I'm afraid. And what that tells me, sometimes it's not a bad idea to honestly tell the Lord about how you feel. And he then concludes this prayer in verse 12 by reminding him again of his promise to treat him well, and the big one, to make his descendants as numerous as the sands on the seashore. That's what God promised Jacob. So he begins and ends the prayer of simply reminding himself and God of the promises that God have made. And he sandwiches in between an acknowledgement that he's not worthy of all this good stuff that God has promised to bestow on him. Now, I would submit that we need to learn to pray more like that. More than once, we will encounter people in the Bible praying by simply reciting back to the Lord what he said he would do. You said you would take care of me. You said you would provide for me, and I'm just reminding you of what you said. You said it, Lord. I'm not worthy of it. I didn't earn it, Lord, but you said it, so please, Lord, do as you have promised. One of the very greatest prayers in all of church history was a fellow called George Muller, who was famous for his praying, both in terms of the amount of time he spent praying and the content of those prayers, which have been written about and published for many years. His main thing that he was well known for was building orphanages and feeding thousands and thousands of orphan children. In his biography, he tells how, when praying, his pattern was just to remind the Lord that these orphans were his children, and that it was his promise in his word that they should be taken care of, and it was his call that the church should be called to take care of orphans, widows and orphans. So he reminded the Lord of what he said in his word. You said, he used to say in his prayers, that you would be father to the fatherless. So one of the things George Muller did in his prayer was he simply said to the Lord, Lord, I'm trying to do your work here, but I acknowledge that it's always your work anyway. So help. Our cupboards are bare. We need food was often his prayer. And there are all kinds of stories of how God responded and provided for that ministry. A guy called Pearson, who wrote the original biography of Muller, said, of course, God did not need to be convinced by Muller's prayers. The claims Muller made in his prayers were just petitions based upon the word of God and his promises. And that, my friends, is the biblical way to pray. That is also the biblical way to respond to danger. To say to the Lord that you have said you will protect me and keep me safe, and Lord, I'm petitioning you to do that. That's why we were told in the New Testament that we are to ask, we are to pray, and in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let our requests be known to him. So that's what he's doing here, and that's what we should be doing also. We should be saying, Lord, I'm just coming before you because I'm fearful. I'm coming before you because that's what you've told me to do, and I'm asking, Lord, for you to do what you've promised. But it's your work, Lord. I'm not worthy of it. This is not, and any blessings are not to do with me. They're just yours. So here we are. This is the situation Jacob's facing. And as I say, the first thing he does is he plans. He divides the group into two camps. The second thing he does is he prays. But there's something else he's going to do. And that, I think, is where this story gets really interesting. But we'll pick that up tomorrow. So friends, as we pick up and continue, we're covering the verses of Genesis chapter 32 from where we left last time to the end of the chapter. And I'd just like to quickly remind you of just whereabouts we're up to. And if you remember, Jacob is now back in the land of Canaan, and he hears that his brother's coming out to meet him. Well, on the surface that sounds like good news, but then he discovers that Esau, his brother, is bringing 400 men with him to meet him. So Jacob is becoming afraid because he thinks his brother might be coming to kill him, and maybe not just kill him, but to kill his entire family as well. So his initial practical response is he initially divides his family into two camps, and then he prays. So we're going to pick up the story in verse 13 and see what he does next, where it says, So he lodged there that same night and took what came to his hand as a present for Esau his brother, 200 female goats and 20 male goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 milk camels and their colts, 40 cows and 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys and 10 foals. Then he delivered them to the hand of his servants, every herd by itself, and said to his servants, "Pass over before me and put some distance between successive droves." So he planned, he prayed, and now the third thing he's doing is he's going to send Esau some presents. He has a plan, he prays, and now he's sending some gifts out with his servants. Now there's a lot of animals here. I think I counted 580. Don't you count? I've already done the adding up. But he hands these huge amount of animals over to his servants, and he says, "Take them and go out and meet Esau, but have the animals driven in front of you." And if we just pick it up again in verse 17, it will tell us, "And he commanded the first one, saying," that's the servant, "When Esau my brother meets you and asks you, saying, 'To whom do you belong, and where are you going? Whose are these in front of you?'" In other words, the animals. "Then you will say, 'They are your servant Jacob's. It is a present sent to my lord Esau, and behold, he is also behind us.'" So he commanded the second and the third and all who followed the droves, saying, "In this manner," in other words, in this way, you should speak to Esau when you find him, and also say, "Behold, your servant Jacob is behind us. For he said, I will appease him with the presents that go before me, and afterwards I will see his face. Perhaps he will accept me." So the presents went on before him, but he himself lodged that night in the camp. So he tells all the servants to say the same thing in the hope that this will appease Esau with the goodwill offerings that he's sending them, which are going to keep appearing one lot after another. So the presents go out at night, and Jacob stays in the camp and sleeps at night. So very simply, let's look at what's going on here. He gathers this huge group of animals and he divides them into, well, we know at least 3 groups, and he puts a distance between each groups, and then he says to the servants, "Head out, and when you meet Esau, which you will, and Esau asks who you are, you must say, 'My lord, this is a present from your brother.'" This means Esau will get a section of the animals, about a third probably, and then he'll travel a little further and he'll meet a second group, and then a third group, and then so on and so on. So it's very clear he's doing what we would today call showering Esau with presents. And that's why in verse 25 it tells us his motivation. He's doing this in the hope, because he says, "I will appease him with these presents." So the point of verses 13 to 21, which we've just covered, is everything he's doing is to make Esau more well disposed, shall we say, to Jacob. Then he says at the end of this section, in verse 20, he says, "Perhaps he will accept me," which not only means by accepting, it also of course means that then perhaps he won't actually kill him. So this is the final part of Jacob's 3-part plan in response to the danger he feels he is facing. He prays, he trusts the Lord at the same time, but he acts responsibly and he tries to make things right by offering these gifts. So this tells me that doing something responsible alongside exercising faith, they're not incompatible. You know, sometimes it's right to do both things. He had a plan, first of all, he then prayed, and then he trusted the Lord. And at the same time, in doing that, he was doing everything he could to avoid, to make peace and avoid further conflict in the future. So then, how should we handle points of conflict, or even for us, potential points of danger that we might have to face? Well, I would say this is a good template. Do it just like this. Firstly, have a plan in case danger comes. And secondly, of course, the thing is we should do is we should pray. Do you think you should pray? Well, hopefully you already know that. Pray, indeed, but sometimes the plan might involve, and the response, the follow-on from the prayer might involve you giving the other party what they want. If you find yourself facing a potential one-to-one conflict in the future, I wonder if you've ever simply asked the other person what you can do to make things right. that sometimes will resolve a whole situation and a whole potential area of conflict. But that's not the end of this story. We'll get to that in a minute. But let's, in the meantime, continue in the text, picking up again in verse 22. It's a long chapter, so we're cracking on through it at a pace. And it tells us, "And he arose that night and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed over the ford of Jabbok. He took them, sent them over the brook, and sent over what he had. Then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day." A man? That's just suddenly appeared in the text, isn't it? What's this about? Now, in my Bible, I note that the word man is capitalized. So, all right, this is suggesting that this is not just an ordinary man. That's why it's capitalized in almost every translation of the Bible in that way. So who is this guy? Well, as you can imagine, if you go in and read all the commentaries, they go into a sort of overdrive trying to explain exactly what's going on here. Some say it is the Lord, and others say, no, that this is a real man. And some say that in a lot of the translations it will say that he wrestled with an angel, and that angel is the angel of the Lord. But I want to tell you what Jacob said about this wrestling match himself. Now, we'll get there in a minute, but if we jump ahead in the story and drop in at verse 30, Jacob, in recounting it, says, "So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, 'It was because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared.'" So his interpretation was he was wrestling with the Lord God at that point. Now, you know I've pointed out that there's this figure that appears in Genesis from time to time called the angel of the Lord, which many believe is actually the Lord himself. And I would say, yes, absolutely, I agree with that. This is an Old Testament appearance of the pre-incarnate Christ, a Christophany, if you want to use one of those big theological words. I think that's what's going on here, and so do many, many other Bible teachers. So let's see what's going to happen when he meets the Lord and wrestles, or what happens when he meets the Lord, and what's going to go on in verse 25. The story picks up. "Now when he saw that he did not prevail against him, he touched the socket of his hip, and the socket of Jacob's hip was out of joint, as he wrestled with him. And he said, 'Let me go, for the day breaks.' But he said, 'I will not let you go until you bless me.'" So here's Jacob here, with his hip out of joint, hanging on to the Lord and wrestling with him. Okay, where are we? Someone came to the door, so I just had to answer it. So apparently they've been wrestling all night, haven't they? But the question that raises in my mind is this. Surely the Lord would have enough strength to overpower Jacob, right? The Lord wrestling with him would be like a grown man wrestling with a 4-year-old child. But sometimes when a father wrestles with a child, he lets the child get the best of him for a minute, doesn't he? Just because the father has all the power doesn't mean he has to use it all the time. And it doesn't mean he will use it all the time with us. So Jacob is not giving up. He just battles on and he says, "I'm not going to let go of you until you bless me." And by the way, a further clue of who this person is, it does state very clearly that whoever it is, they have the power to bless Jacob, the power to do that, right? So that's another thing that points to the fact that this angel of the Lord is who I've said he is. Anyway, continuing in verse 27, it says, "So he said to him, 'What's your name?' And he said, 'Jacob.' And he said, 'Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed.' Then Jacob asked, saying, 'Tell me your name, I pray.' And he said, 'What is it that you ask about my name?' And he blessed him there." So he says to him, "What's your name? Okay, I'm going to bless you." But he asks him what his name is, and he replies, "Jacob." And he said, "Your name should no longer be called Jacob, but Israel." And he says, "It is because you have struggled with God and men and prevailed. That's why that name is going to be given to you." And it continues, "So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, For I had seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. And just as he crossed over Peniel, the sun rose on him, and he limped on his hip. Therefore to this day the children of Israel do not eat the muscle, that shank in the shank which is in the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip. Now that custom, by the way, is not repeated and carried forward into the Mosaic law. The children of Israel did this as a memorial meal, and they obviously did it at least up in time until the time of the book of Genesis being written, but it was not perpetuated past this point or ratified under the Mosaic law going forward. Now this is a very famous passage of scriptures, and I could have approached it as a separate unit in its own right. And everybody, a lot of people know about it, and everybody seems to agree that what is going on here is Jacob is wrestling with the Lord and saying, I'm not turning you loose, Lord, until you bless me. And the application of that is that we are indeed called to wrestle with the Lord. And how we do that in the modern context is in prayer. And we should do the same and not stop until the Lord blesses us. Now, in the process, he got his name changed. Jacob was his original name. Just by the way, do you remember what that name meant? It was a long time ago, but when he and his twin brothers were born was when he was named. They were twins, and he came out holding on to the heel of his brother. So the name Jacob, which was given to him, actually meant heel grabber. But he's now had his name changed to Israel, which means God is upright. But the story doesn't end there, and there's more to say, and it will continue on into chapter 33, which we'll be looking at next time. But at this point in the narrative, he's faced danger, and because of that, he made a plan to protect his family. He prayed and he offers presents to try and avoid any potential conflict with his brother. And then he has this situation where he wrestles with the Lord all night until the Lord agrees to bless him. And the text says that God did indeed bless him. So don't forget that he blessed him. And at that point, he changed his name to Israel. So I want to conclude by breaking down any possible application that we might be able to apply about this into just some small bite-sized pieces. And I'd do that by asking us to consider the fact of, have we ever faced danger, and what should we do when we face danger? Or perhaps have we ever just made people or an individual angry or hostile with us? Well, what I believe we should do is what Jacob did. And the first thing he did was to pause and make a plan. He developed a plan for his protection and for the protection of those that he loved. Now, some say that planning indicates that you're not trusting the Lord, and I completely disagree with that point of view. I don't think there's anything anywhere in the Bible that says that you should not practically do things and plan to do things practically whilst at the same time trusting in the Lord for the outcome. And I think that's what Jacob does here. So firstly, he prays, and he prays a lot. This whole chapter is about prayer, but in the process, he has also some thought out plans as well, and that's what we should be doing, planning and praying. Now, the second thing I want to say is he developed the plan, and but throughout it all, he deeply maintained his desire for God's blessing. He wasn't just trying to plan his way out of danger. He wanted God to bless him, and he was so vociferous about that. He wanted it so much to the point where he wrestled with God all night to get it. Now, the reason I want to go over this again is I want to make this point very clear. Jacob had to wrestle with God to the point where he had to walk with a limp for the rest of his life. And I suppose then that raises the question, do we have to battle with God to the point whereby we will be marked for life in order for God to bless us? Well, that may be true for some of us because of our difficult natures, but the answer is not necessarily. And I would point to the fact that neither Abraham or Isaac needed to go to this point to do this. But the point is, Jacob because of his character and his personality, he had to wrestle with the Lord. But the point is, he still remained and still had a deep desire to receive God's blessings. And he kept throughout it saying, Lord, I will wrestle with you until you bless me. So very clearly, in his own way, Jacob was dependent on the Lord, and he was so from the very beginning. And in this situation, he prayed, Lord, he said he felt he needed the Lord's protection. He asked the Lord to protect him, and he asked the Lord to bless him, whilst at the same time recognizing he was not actually worthy of receiving that blessing. And when facing danger, he prayed. Now, and the type of prayer that he prayed, I can't think of a more perfect prayer for us if we're facing danger, because ultimately it recognized who God is and who he was before a holy God. It recognized that God was the sovereign choice in all and any blessings that he would receive, and it also recognized the fact that he himself had no claim that he can make upon it. It was simply promising what the Lord had already promised. So the fact that remained, that even in his prayer and his petitions, he remembered the fact that he had not earned it, simply that God had promised it. Now, we need to remember that Jacob was a deceiver. He was a scoundrel at times, even an out-and-out liar. Yet we see him here reach a point in his life where he comes to the Lord and says, Lord, I'm not worthy, but because you have promised these things to me, I'm still hanging on. So I'd like to close by saying, not only did he have a plan, but he developed the plan. He deeply desired God's blessing, and he remained determined that he would receive it. He wouldn't let go of God. He said, I'm not quitting. He wrestled all night with the Lord, saying, I'm not quitting. Even if you knock my hip out of joint, I'm not quitting. I'm going to constantly badger you. I'm going to constantly wrestle with you, Lord, until you answer me and bless me in the way you said you would bless me. And that's what's going on here. He said, Lord, I want your blessing, and I am determined to get it, even if that takes all night. And that, Lord, that is what we also need to do, I believe. We need to wrestle with the Lord, which for us will usually mean prayer. Now, you may remember at the opening of this section, I mentioned this guy, George Mueller, and how he has been held up in church history and modern church history as a great example of prayer. There's a story that at one point in his life, George Mueller prayed for 5 of his close friends. After a few months, one of them came to know the Lord. 10 years later, another was converted, but it took a quarter of a century for the third man to get saved, and 25 years after that for the fourth. But Mueller never gave up. He persisted in prayer for all of his life. The last of those 5 people he prayed for, are you ready for this? It took 52 years before he came to faith, and that event only occurred a few days after George Mueller's own funeral. And you know what, friends? We all need to do this. We all need to pray earnestly and consistently. Pray, 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 pray. All week, all month, all year, every year. Pray for a decade. Pray for half a century. Pray for all our lives if necessary. And pray like Jacob prayed. Say, Lord, I'm determined that you are going to do what you promised to do in my life. And I'm going to trust that you will do it, because I know who you are and I know your character. And I'm going to keep praying until you bless me. Amen.